Hello, my name is Alexis Bailey. I'm an undergraduate in sociology, and today I'll be providing some context on the American Indian Movement, known as AIM, and the event Trail of Broken Treaties. To begin, I want to say that I chose this topic specifically because, as someone who identifies partially with the Native American community, I do not find that we speak quite enough about the history pertaining to this group beyond colonization and westward expansion era. It is also National Native American Heritage Month, a time in which we pay tribute to the rich ancestry and traditions of Native Americans. That being said, let's dive in. So, what is AIM? As I mentioned before, it stands for the American Indian Movement. It was founded by Clyde Belcourt, whose Ojibwe name is Nikonwi Wewidun, Thunder Before the Storm, as well as Dennis Banks, Eddie Benton, and George Mitchell, as well as others. They all wanted to create a conference or a meeting in which they address issues of health, education, housing, welfare, and even brutality against the Native Americans in America. The Red Power movement and AIM expanded and combined when the Trail of Broken Treaties occurred in 1972. The Red Power movement demanded the ability to govern oneself, otherwise known as self-determination. They were also influenced heavily by the Black freedom movements that also occurred around this time. Pictured on the right is some young Native protesters and Clyde Belcourt himself. The Trail of Broken Treaties began in October of 1972. Caravans of protesters were heading for Washington, D.C., coming from Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. The protesters met in Minnesota, where Hank Adams, pictured on the right, drafted the 20 points. Now, the 20 points consisted of a set of demands for President Nixon. These demands included the restoration of treaty making, which ended in 1871, a summit in which Native leaders addressed Congress, 110 million acres of land to be returned, restoration of tribes, repeal of state jurisdiction, and an Office of Federal Indian Relations. This, of course, did not go as planned. To begin the spiral of events, members of Congress had not arrived by the time the caravans did. In fact, AIM was a week early. This resulted in nearly 1,000 natives occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs from November 3rd through the 9th. The riot police were dispersed, saying that they had to leave or be forcefully evicted. The protesters then caused $2 million in damage to the BIA. Something to note is that even after their departure, Nixon did not address the issues. The media also did not, only focusing on the damage caused by the protesters. Two additional events that I'll summarize briefly consisted of Wounded Knee and Alcatraz. Wounded Knee was said to begin on February 27th and lasted until May 7th of 1973, meaning that Wounded Knee was only months after the Trail of Broken Treaties. The massacre of Wounded Knee was centered around Leader Wilson, the BIA, the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, otherwise known as Goons, and the FBI, of course. AIM had occupied Wounded Knee following a failed attempt to impeach the tribal president Wilson. Wilson was known as a corrupt leader, and the lack of justice caused AIM to arrive at the location, as well as making a statement about their unrecognized demands to the government. By the 20th of February, a day after, the FBI and law enforcement had arrived, armed. Roadblocks were set, fires were lit to cut off supplies for the protesters, as well as there actually being weapons fired. Only 2 natives died in the 71-day siege, but it captured media attention. The militant view of the Native Americans persisted. Alcatraz lasted over 19 months compared to the 71 days of Wounded Knee, although it occurred before the Trail of Broken Treaties. From November of 69 to June of 71, 30 natives from various tribes lived on the island. This number grew to nearly 400. Like many other protest intentions, the natives sought to bring attention to the issues that previously and currently plagued them. Alcatraz is so important because it was one of the first protests that was intertribal in nature, resulting in a group being called IOAT, Indians of All Tribes. I won't talk too much about this since I've already mentioned it before, but the FBI essentially wanted to neutralize AIM since the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The FBI charged a few of the natives after Wounded Knee, such as Leonard Peltier. The point of the arrest was not to lock them away, but to disrupt the movement. Removing the leaders of any political movement is a sure way to dampen or halt the movement. Last but not least, I would like to speak on some of the nonviolent authors and readings that I have learned recently. I have chosen Thoreau and King respectively. I have also chosen to view these events from a Last but not least, I would like to speak on some of the nonviolent authors and readings that I have learned recently. I have chosen Thoreau and King respectively. I have also chosen to view these events from a nonviolent standpoint, although weaponry and deaths were involved in some of the conflicts. Henry Thoreau had a natural suspicion of state and did not trust the systems that were in place. Therefore, voting is rendered useless, especially in terms of violence done to a group of people, such as the Native American populations. Thoreau was also an advocate for self-determination, a term I'd used earlier in our slides. To recap, it is the ability to govern oneself. MLK was a leader of the Civil Rights Movement, which occurred before and possibly during the creation of the American Indian Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke on the premise that freedom must be demanded because it will not be given. He also spoke on the sentiment that in protests and demonstrations, one must be able to accept the consequences as well. We know this to be relevant because despite the hostility given to their demonstrations, they had accepted any arrests or even the arrival of FBI themselves, but were unwavering. Native American history is not just for a day, nor is it just a month. Native Americans, or the people, have been treated unequally in the eyes of society, similar to those of the Black community. It is important to learn of the Trail of Broken Treaties, of Wounded Knee and Alcatraz, not for whether or not it succeeded, but the message trying to be spread. Thank you for your time and for listening to my brief overview of the American Indian Movement and some of the events that occurred within it.